Professor Henry Giroux, an English and Cultural Studies professor at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, is my guest on Truthout Interviews, and he's here to talk about the rise of global authoritarianism and the waning of democracy. Henry, welcome back to Truthout Interviews.
Oh, thanks. Delighted to be here.
Well, let's talk about the ideology of neoliberalism to start out, okay? We'll talk about this for a moment. The word itself, neoliberalism, you break it apart, neo means new, liberal generally means a kind of openness, but this ideology and this movement is anything but new or open.
Well, I think it is new, but it certainly isn't open. And I think it's new in the sense that in the past, liberalism had a sense of what it meant to at least address social kinds of injustices and to somehow deal with what it called the social contract. It was willing to provide political concessions. I mean, it wanted to keep the labor-capital relationship somewhat in balance. But what you have now under neoliberalism is you have an entirely different set of structures. Power is now separate from politics. Politics is local and power is global. And as a result of this, what you have are corporations that could care less about political concessions and could care less about the social contract. So you have a much more savage form of liberalism at work in this sense. And if you had to talk about certain assumptions that characterize it, you would talk about deregulation, you would talk about excessive privatization, you would talk about how everything is for sale, profit is the essence of democracy, consumerism is the only obligation of citizenship. And you would also talk about the selling off of public goods and the attack on the welfare state and the attack on social provision. So I think, these are just some of the elements that we all know about that add up to something very, very different than neoliberalism. There are two moments historically that mark this movement. And one, of course, is Ronald Reagan saying that there's no such thing, that government is the problem and not the solution. So what you have is an attempt now to starve the government and to sell off all of its functions to private corporations. So you have a government that now moves away from the welfare state. That's the first issue. Secondly, you have Margaret Thatcher claiming there's no such thing as society. They're only individuals. And I think that's the other really central element of neoliberalism, in which it makes the claim that all that matters are individuals and their interest, their self-interest. That anything that has to do with the social or with the common good or with social welfare basically is, if not a pathology, is something that we need to disdain and move away from. It's marked by a kind of rabid individualism that in turn removes itself from any sense of ethical responsibility. The market drives politics, not the other way around. And as such, the market doesn't care about social cause. It doesn't care about ethics. It doesn't care about social responsibility. All that matters is the accumulation of capital. In the end, what this is really a retrenchment of class power at a level like we've never seen before.
Yeah, I think that, for 30 plus years, we've been told through politicians, some conceding the fact that, yes, we are all individuals, or government is the problem. Even Bill Clinton talked about how the era of big government was over and he was a Democrat. But, I've been thinking a lot about social media and surveillance. The NSA is the big story in the news these days. But the other story that rarely gets told is how people voluntarily give up this information to social media outlets.
One of the great tragedies of the 21st century is that the public has collapsed into the private. And consequently, the private is the only realm there is by which people can actually understand the world and define their own personalities. So we don't have, the attack is not on privacy. The real issue here is that there's an exit from privacy. People don't want to be private. They don't want a private life. They take everything in their private life and make it public because that's the only space where the public matters to them anymore. That's a real crisis of democracy. And I think that then when you look at the organized modes of power that take advantage of that, one, you have the controlling state in the form of the NSA and 16 other intelligence agencies, by the way. It's not just the NSA, that are mining all this information and violating people's civil rights. But then you have these corporations that not only work with the government in mining information, but actually mine information for reasons of consumerism, to promote commercial transactions, to turn people into commodities, to know what their buying habits are. But what's frightening about all of this is that these two modes of control, the corporate and the state, they work with each other. They're called fusion centers. The other side of this, I guess, is that this is really not, as I've said, not just about privacy. It's really about freedom. It's really about dissent. I mean, my greatest fear with these agencies is not that they're simply invading our privacy, which we've given up anyways, for the most part. You know, the greatest fear here is that these agencies come together, corporate and state, to basically squelch any form of dissent. So the real issue that's online here is the question of freedom, not just simply the question of privacy.
You speak a lot about democracy. How do you define it?
I think democracy means that power, the power to govern, the power to have access to resources, the power to make important decisions should not be in the hands of minorities. They should be in the hands of everyone. And I think to the degree to which power is removed from the vast majority of the population is the degree to which you can say you no longer live in a democracy. I mean, there's a study that just came out of Princeton that said that policies over the since 1980, they analyzed something like thousands of policies, and 95% of those policies were basically engineered to serve the interests of the rich, the 1%. And the conclusion that they came to is that the people who are in Washington who are making these policies have no interest in what the public believes, none whatsoever. Whether we're talking about abortion or whether we're talking about inequality or whether we're talking about immigration, they don't care. And their conclusion was Princeton University, no less. This is not actually a citadel of democracy, right? Princeton University came to the conclusion that we live in an oligarchy, that the United States is a country controlled basically by the rich. And so I think that democracy now becomes a mask that people invoke to basically hide real structures of power that are enormously anti-democratic and don't border, but actually, in my estimation, now are deeply authoritarian.
You're a professor, and you've been teaching for a number of years, I take it, and you bemoan the fact that the university itself has become corporatized. It is much more of a top-down organization. It's always been kind of a top-down organization, but more so. Very top-heavy with administrators, cutting away the power of professors, relying more on contingent workers as adjuncts. But you also have the students as well. And this idea of democracy gets squelched as students become less educated to think for themselves and to question authority, and more about being trained to assume certain jobs within society.
What's so tragic about what's happening to the university in the United States, and in England especially, is that a certain kind of instrumental rationality has taken over the university, in which questions of values no longer matter, public values, in which questions of justice no longer matter, in which those academic disciplines and those faculties that don't translate immediately into training or into skills or basically don't bring in capital, as quickly as possible, that are sort of low on the what you might call the ability to muster profits, all of a sudden are being eliminated. And in the midst of all of that, the university is redefining not only its mission and its purpose, it's also redefining the role of academics as basically temporary workers, as Walmart workers. I mean, you know the figures. I mean, 70% of all academics in the United States are now basically on non-tenure track lines or adjuncts, part-time workers. Many of them now are part of the fastest growing population for food stamps. And then you have, of course, students who are being screwed. I mean, they're being taught that they're basically consumers. They're not being taught that the university is a place where they should learn to think critically about themselves, their relationship to others in the world, and take advantage of a vast treasure trove of knowledge that would expand their understanding of those dimensions. But they're told that they're there to basically get jobs. That's what they're there for. And I think that what has happened is that the university has been robbed of that moment where you could imagine it being a place where the imagination bloomed, a place where agency was expanded, a place where people could imagine a different world other than the one that they now live in. And I think that's the great tragedy. I mean, agency is being crippled in the university, both by the way in which the university maintains and governs itself, and by the way it defines itself, and by the way it treats its students and its faculty.
The characterization of the left by the right is usually of this very organized big force that's basically going to come and get your mama, if you will. But in your article, and what I've seen in general, is that they're not as organized as they're characterized. It's more of a disorganization problem.
the real problem the left faces are twofold. One, the left is too fragmented. And being fragmented, it's very difficult for them to organize in ways in which they can come together and really address the totality of the problems that society faces. So there's got to be a way to bring these groups together to form a third party or form an alternative social formation, and to do what it does best, basically to make power visible, but also to offer alternatives. It just cannot die in the language of, it can't suspend itself in the language of critique. That's important, but it's not enough. Secondly, it's going to take the question of education seriously. I mean, there's going to be no movement, there's going to be no attempt to reform this country or radicalize it, or think about a different alternative until people have access to alternative points of view, until they have access to ideas that challenge these neoliberal assumptions that the market is all there is, that the future is bleak, that precarity is central to democracy, that the rich should rule the world, that the 1% have earned their money as opposed to, engaging in criminogenic activities in order to accumulate their wealth. I mean, there are a whole sense of assumptions that now people are locked in that prevent them from understanding that they're complicitous with a system that really sees them as disposable, as excess, that they're no longer valuable. I mean, and this is increasingly now moving into the middle class and among a whole range of other groups now, especially including young people, but especially young, marginalized and poor minorities. Remember, we live in a country that basically operates in two modes. It operates at one level with the soft hand of social welfare, which is now increasingly being attacked and diminished. The other hand is the fist. That's the punishing state that increasingly now criminalizes every form of behavior. If you're homeless, that's not a problem, that's a crime. We don't wage a war against poverty, we wage a war against the poor, right? Students commit an infraction in school, like a dress infraction violation. They're not talked to. They're put in a police car and handcuffed and sent off to the local police station. Women now, we don't talk about what we can do to expand the possibility of their agency. We now say their reproductive rights basically are a criminal issue, and they'll go to jail if they don't do this or that. So you really have a country that's turned into a war zone. I mean, the wars abroad are now, neoliberalism now wages wars at home. And so I think that what we have here is a crisis not only of democracy, we have a crisis of what it means to respond to that attack on democracy. And that's got to be rethought in a whole range of ways. The Occupy movement was really enormously helpful in that. They created a new language, they spoke of alternative futures, and they challenged some of the most basic assumptions of neoliberal capitalism, global capitalism. But now we have to move on. Now the long march through the institutions has to take place. Now we have to create institutions that educate people. We have to take over the alternative media. We have to bring groups together. We have to create an alternative social formation in the form of a political party or something else that really says we don't need reform. We need something new.
Henry, I want to thank you again for being on Truthout Interviews.
Sure.
You can read a longer version of some of the points discussed in this interview on the interview Henry, did with CJ Polychroniou called The Specter of Authoritarianism and the Future of the Left, an interview with Henry A. Giroux. And that's Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Astorgadu. Thanks for watching.